So now that we've wrapped up the rendering process, let's take a moment in this video and introduce ourselves to the idea of compositing. So what do we have at the end of our rendering process? Well, we've got a series of image sequences that we've got saved out to disk, and we can see those if we bring up our file browser and take a look through our different shot folders. Let's say shot 3, and we've got all of our various objects, and we can jump inside there and see all of the various lighting passes we've got for those objects. And you may take a step back and look at all of these passes that we've just rendered out and be very daunted by the prospect of bringing these passes back together. But compositing doesn't have to be daunting if we make sure that we plan ahead of time of how we're going to approach everything and try and make everything as logical and as, I guess, make sure we can reuse things as much as possible. Then it doesn't have to be a daunting process. In fact, it can be an extremely fun process because we now have complete artistic control over the final look of our image. So in this video, I want to take an overview look at how we're going to approach compositing over the next few videos, just so everyone's comfortable with where we're going and the direction that we're taking. So what exactly is compositing? We talked about compositing when we talked about breaking everything up into render passes. If I go back to an earlier whiteboard, we saw that we talked about breaking our render down into a series of different passes. I think this was going to be a couple of diffuse passes. I think we have some specular and some shadow passes here. And through compositing, we can bring these back together and create our final image. Now, there's no better way to explain compositing than to show through example. So I'm going to jump over into Houdini and throw together a few of our passes, probably actually looking very similar to this, to reconstruct just a small section of our final sequence, just so that you guys can see compositing in action, get a feel for how compositing works. This isn't going to be reused for our final sequence. We're basically going to do everything step by step, much slower in the final videos for compositing. This is more of an example of just how do you go about throwing together our different passes.
It's more or less a proof of concept, demonstrating that here we are with a bunch of different rendered out images, and now here's a final result where those images have now been layered in such a way that we have the result we were looking for.
Exactly. So I'm going to jump over into Houdini. And the first thing I'm going to do is create a new file, because we don't want all of our existing file basically cluttering up our scene. Since all we're dealing with now is the rendered image data on our disk and not all of our geometry and shaders and lights and everything that we've already got in our scene file, we can simply create a new file as a new slate for working in. And in this new file, I'm going to switch over to the composite view, and that's going to take us over into the compositing networks context. And inside the compositing networks context, I'm going to create a new image network. Jumping down inside will put us into the compositing context. And inside of this context, we can now start working with those passes that we've rendered out. And the first thing we need to do is bring those passes in. So to do that, I'm going to create a file cop by pushing tab to bring up the tab menu, typing file, enter to grab that, enter to drop that into our network, and by default we bring in a default picture of a butterfly, but I'm going to browse and bring in a different image. So I'm going to browse and hunt down our files. I'm thinking I want to bring together our main spotlights for our character in shot 2.
Okay.
I want to bring in the main spotlights for our stage in shot 2, and I want to bring in the shadows for our main spotlights in shot 2. So that we,
at the end, see our character sitting on the stage being properly lit by those two lights, as well as the stage being properly lit by those two lights, and shadows being cast from our character.
So we'll take a look at diffuse passes, specular passes, and shadow passes in this video, a very, very brief look at them.
So let's start with some diffuse, our character's main spotlights.
Yeah, so let's jump into shot 2, let's grab our character, and we can see all of the various passes for our character, and we're after our main spotlights diffuse. So I'm going to load those in. And we're not going to see anything in our view at the moment. Why? Because we're looking at frame 1. And if you recall, shot 2 went from frame 219 up to frame 300. So I'm going to bring up my animation options. And I'm going to set this to go from 219 up to 300, just for this simple example. And we can apply and cancel that out. And jump back over. So now we go from 219 to 300, and when we scrub the play bar, we're going to see our main spotlights diffuse pass on our character. And this view works very similarly to MPlay. We have the ability to switch between our color and alpha channels. We can also switch between various other planes if we have them. And it allows us to scrub our main Houdini time slider and actually scrub through our frames. So now that we've got our diffuse information coming in, we need to bring in the rest of our information. And I'm going to use the backtick, which is a shortcut for right-clicking and going to add add file operator, backtick or equals will bring that up, and that allows us to bring in multiple passes at once if we so wish. So I'm going to select our main spot specular, click accept. It will bring in a new file cop and bring in the specular pass for our main character. I'm going to push backtick again, jump up a folder and jump into the set folder and grab the main spots diffuse and specular by holding shift, and this is going to allow us to bring in multiple file cops at once. Click accept. We'll bring in two file cops, one for our sets diffuse for the main spots. Now the specular pass for the main spots in this case isn't going to really be of use, since the camera angle that we've got and the way we have our lights set up, we can't actually see the specular highlights, but I'll bring it in anyway. It's always good practice to composite in together. In case we decide to re-render this shot from a different camera angle where we could see the specular, we can then just make use of this network again. I'm going to push backtick one last time, jump up and grab our shadow pass for the main spotlights for shot 2. And we're not going to see our shadow pass in the color view. We've seen that we need to switch over to look at alpha in order to see our shadows. So how do we go about combining these 5 separate image sequences into a final image that's going to have our main spotlights for the character, our main spotlights for the set, and our shadows? Well, there are a couple of different approaches that you can take to bringing together all of these different images. And the way we're going to work, we're going to composite together all of the images that make up a particular object first. And once we have that object in place, we're then going to layer that object over another object, over another object. So in this case, we'll bring together our lights for our character, and we'll bring together our lights for our set, and then we can layer those over the top of each other. So how do we go about bringing together the diffuse pass for our character and the specular pass for our character? And we're going to talk in more detail in the next video about how we can combine diffuse and specular. There are a couple of different approaches you can take. It is a personal preference. But you're going to find in that video that we choose to use a screen to bring together these two pieces of information. And what a screen will do is effectively adds together the two pieces of lighting information, which, if you recall from when we discussed shaders, the specular and the diffuse components in a lighting model do get added together. So it's going to work very much like a lighting model. So I'm going to right click on the output and screen these together. Now screen does work slightly differently from truly adding them, and we'll discuss this in the next video, but for this proof of concept it's enough to think about screen as adding these two passes together. And we can see on the screen that we do have specular highlights and diffuse. To prove this, we can change the weighting for these two different passes. If we drop our foreground, that's our diffuse, we can see we have the specular on its own. As we boost that back up, the specular being added to our diffuse. Or we can come in, and this will make this really clear, we can also decrease the specular pass as well. And we can repeat that for combining the diffuse and specular for our set. So I'm going to right click, wire into a screen cop, and then wire our set in the specular for our set into the screen cop. So now we have the lighting for our character and the lighting for our set, but we need to bring these together. And how would we go about doing that? Well, we need to think of these objects as being solid objects, and we need to think of layering one object over the top of another object. Now, as the camera sees it, we know that our character needs to sit on top of our stage, because the stage is underneath the character. Our character is sitting on top of the stage. And that's why when we were rendering out certain render passes, for a couple of our passes, we needed masks, because there are situations where we need to be both on top of and underneath an object. But in this case, our character simply needs to sit on top of our stage, so we can layer our character over the stage, and to do that we can use a layer cop. So I'm going to push tab and create a layer cop. And how do we go about layering these? Well, we need to start from background and work to foreground. So our set is going to be our backmost layer, and our character is going to be our foreground layer. And if we bring our visibility down, we can now see that our character has been layered over the top of the set. How does it know how to do this? It takes the alpha information that we have, and our alpha information for our character is simply just the character. So it will layer this part of the image over the top of our set, which if we bring our visibility down to the layer, we can see that we've got our character here where our alpha information is, and that's been layered over our set. But it looks kind of weird. We don't have our shadows having a role. And in this case, for this simple example, I'm going to layer the shadows after we've combined our character and our set together. You're going to see over the next few videos we're going to take a slightly different approach to compositing our shadows in with regards to compositing them in on an object by object basis, but we'll see why we're doing that in a little while. So for now we have effectively our final image, and we have shadows, which if we jump over to our alpha, we can see our shadows in the alpha, and we need to affect our final image with these shadows. Well, how are we going to do this? We can see that our color is completely black. It's a completely black color channel. So we could think about layering black over the top of our existing image, and layering the black over the image such that we only want black where we have shadows. So our alpha is going to describe how we layer images. So our alpha is going to describe how we effectively paint black on top of our existing image. Where we have bright white in the alpha, we're going to have the darkest shadows. We're going to be painting the most black. Where we have a slightly grey alpha, we're going to be painting some amount of black. Where we have a black alpha, we have no shadows, so we won't paint any black. Now the node that we're going to be using over the next series of videos for bringing in shadows is going to be the composite cop. And this works very much like the composite VOP that we saw in the first TD volume. And the composite VOP worked by taking in an A alpha, a B and a B alpha. This composite cop takes in an A and a B, and we can also obviously have alpha information going into those inputs. And the way it works, it's going to by default layer A over B, using the alpha information in A to describe which parts of A get layered over B. So we can layer our shadows over our set, and the alpha information is going to describe where we get those shadows. So we're only darkening down the image where we have those shadows. So now we can see if we scrub our timeline, we've brought in our main spotlights, both diffuse and specular, for both the character and the set, and then we've layered the shadows for the main spotlights over, and now we have nice control over our scene. But why do we go to all of that effort of breaking everything down just to bring it all back together to see a final image? Well, the reason we do this is that we now have control over this network. We can jump into any of these branches of the network, and we can manipulate the image data that's flowing through it and do anything that we like to it. We can color correct it, we can blur it, we can fade it, we can do anything that we like. And that means that we can come in and say, I really like this diffuse lighting, but I'm not happy, say, with the color of this diffuse lighting, so let's wire a color correct onto the end, and we're going to take a look at the color correct in an extreme amount of detail in an upcoming video. But for simplicity, I'm going to simply multiply the color and push our character towards a green color just to make things very extreme.
He's a bit ill.
But we haven't affected our specular, we've only affected our diffuse. So we layer the specular back on top, and we haven't affected our set. Our set is still coming in as before. So if we layer those over, we've only affected our character, and then we can bring our shadows in on top of that. So by having complete control over where we wire different operators in our network, we have complete control over exactly which elements of an image are we going to affect. Say we aren't happy with that color correct, we can delete that back out. We can also control things like our weighting when we're screening things together. So we can say, actually, I don't want all of that diffuse light. I want a bigger focus on our specular light, or however you artistically want to take the final sequence, you have now complete control. Before, if we'd have rendered everything out as a single pass, it would have been very hard to go in and isolate just the diffuse pass for a particular light on a particular object. But because we have everything separated, we can now come in and work with any element that we like. So that's a very quick look at bringing together diffuse, specular and shadow, and in the next video we will take a much more in-depth look. But how about the overall approach that we're going to take to compositing? Well, for that I'm going to jump back to the whiteboard, and let's bring up a new layer. So if I hide out this guy and get rid of that, and make sure that I have a brush, fantastic. Well, what we're going to do, we're going to take the idea of compositing together all of the lighting passes that we have for a particular object, so that we have an object finalized. And what do I mean by that? Well, we can see that, say for shot 3, we have a series of objects. We've got our audience, we've got our character, we've got our floor, we've got our set, and we've got our stadium. I'm going to composite together all of the passes we find in our audience folder, such that we have the audience fully composited. I'm then going to go and composite all of the passes that we find in our character folder, so we have the character fully composited. So we could represent this as something like a series of passes. We could have any number of passes depending on which object we're compositing, and we're going to bring all of these together to form a single pass that represents an object. So these are lights, and that's going to produce an object. Now, once we have an object in place, we're going to have things like our stage, well, not our stage, our stadium. We're going to have our audience. We're going to have our set, which is our stage, pool, and ladder. We're going to have our floor. We're going to have our character. So we're going to have basically a whole load of passes that are being composited together to form our various objects. And once we've completed each of those objects, we can then go ahead and layer them together to build the final scene. And we need to obviously take consideration into the order that we layer these in so that we go from background to foreground. And again, that's why we needed the mask shader on a couple of those objects to aid in that process. But we're going to layer these together such that once they're layered together, we're going to have a final image that has all of the lights for all of our objects composited back together. Now, there is one final step after this, and that is once we have this final image, we can affect this with our depth information to add a finer level of control of doing things like depth of field and doing things like darkening the rear of our image compared to the front. Now, where do shadows come into play in all of this? Well, the way we're going to deal with shadows, we're going to deal with shadows on an object-by-object basis. And the reason for this is such that we can affect the shadows on our floor separately to the shadows on our set, separately to the shadows on our character. And so we're going to basically, when we bring together, say, the main spotlights for our character, we'll affect those with the shadows for all of the objects, but just for main spotlights. But it's only really going to affect our character because our character's alpha is going to mean that only that part of the image is actually used. So then when we come ahead and we composite those in for the set, we're now going to be affecting the set with the shadows for our main spotlights. Once we layer the character back over our set, we'll have the shadows for both the character and the set affected by both of the two objects. Now, how are we going to approach this in such a way that we don't have to do a whole load of work over and over again? Well, what we can do, we can see that we have these various objects, and these objects crop up again and again and again in various different shots. So what if we were to build each of these objects such that they became compositing assets, so that instead of having to worry about all of this network that goes on inside an object, we just have to worry about, we have a character in this shot, and we can drop in our character asset. And when we drop in our character asset, at the top level, our artist is going to basically see a series of parameters whereby we can specify a sequence of files. So we'd specify, say, the diffuse for our main spots, the specular for our main spots, the shadow for our main spots, and for our secondary lights, and for our rim lights, and our fill, and our bounce. We'd have a whole load of files that we'd specify, and that would go and jump down into the network and set up all of the files that we're bringing in to look at the right sequences. We'd then have things like sliders that would allow us to control the diffuse intensity, the specular intensity, the shadow intensity for certain lights, the overall intensity of certain lights. So we'd have an artist level of control of just simply saying, I need a character in this scene, dropping that in, making sure we have all the files set up for the character, and then instead of worrying about what's going on under the hood, all we need to worry about is these series of sliders that let us manipulate those images. So once we have all of these assets in place, we can simply drop in the assets that we need, layer them together in the correct order using a layer, affect them by the depth for that shot, and we'd have the final shot composited, and it would be a very quick, very efficient process compared to recreating the network using just all of our nodes from scratch for every shot. That would be a very tedious process. We're going to take things one step further with our efficiency, and we can think about some of these assets actually being building blocks for other assets. Let's think about our set. Our set has the main spotlights and it has the secondary spotlights. Well, we know that our character has those lights as well, but he also has some extra lights. So what if we were to composite together our set and then reuse that inside our character and build onto it, then bringing in our rim lights, our fill light, our bounce light? We'd then have a character asset, but we'd only be doing part of the work because we've already got the set that's compositing together our main spots and our secondary spots. In the same way, our stadium has a top-down light and a bounce light, which we know our audience also has, along with things like the rim light, which has diffuse and specular. So we could reuse our stadium asset inside the audience asset, meaning that we, again, are doing less work. We're just reusing functionality we've already built. The floor has the exact same rights as the set, so we don't even need to build a floor asset. We can just use the set asset for the floor. So we can see that we only really need to build a few assets, and those assets are then going to be able to be reused over and over again, and that's going to prove extremely useful. So that's the approach we're going to take over the next few videos. We're going to step by step build up a sequence of assets that build on previous assets that we've made, and in doing so we're also going to explain every new concept that we cover, things like diffuse and specular and shadow passes. When we first hit those and we're using diffuse and specular passes, we'll cover why we composite them in such a specific way, and maybe other ways, alternative ways that you could go about compositing them if you like. So over the next series of videos, step by step, we're going to be building up these assets. Once we have all the assets in place for a particular shot, we'll go ahead and layer them together and work with our depth information so that we can finalize a shot, and then we'll move on building more assets until we have another shot's worth of assets complete. So hopefully you guys have got a good feeling for where we're going to be going with compositing, and over the next series of videos we're going to take a much more in-depth look at the various areas in compositing. Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I think that wraps things up quite nicely, and it's time to get started with a little compositing.
Cool, thanks a lot.